Sadly, we will not be that technical. We are going to delve into other stuff, and we have a lot of things to go through. I, on the other side, have more corporate slides. Expect no fun, no pictures, no nothing. But I think you could be on your toes. So, as I said, boomer, the boomer reference you could think about during this talk. If you know, you know. Either you're too young. So we're going to talk about collaboration. The hardest part of software development is people. It's not technology. And how could we improve? So the perspective, since most of us are developers, is understanding how you could use collaboration techniques from within tech teams or in the outer scope. A lot of the things I'm going to talk about is of course applicable the higher up the chain you goes, but more about that later. So first, I always show this picture. I think nearly every one of us is good-hearted and means well, but as you know, time is a void that is filled by something. So if you're thriving on vague perspectives or requirements, I suspect we are going to introduce complexity. And one thing to lose complexity is to have a shared understanding of what needs to be done, so you don't end up in a void. You have all been in projects where your client doesn't know where they are heading, requirements are vague, you're iterating on the same requirement, adding things you don't need, and then build a snowball effect and into unmaintainable code. So complexity is fun, but seldom needed. The other thing that some developers go around is meetings are boring. Yeah, meetings could be boring if they are informative from one perspective to you. Meetings should be collaborative. You need to be there because you have a say, or you participate or collaborate, and hopefully you could turn some meetings around using some of the techniques we're going to talk about today. And of course, you have all been handed stone tablets back in the day, fixed requirements, no influence, just do as said, this is the spec. And some of you might have heard or still thinks that, he sounds like he's talking about design up front. That's evil. No. Designing up front and having a shared understanding is not evil. Bad practices that's wrongly implemented agile or an overbelief in TDD and stuff like that leads you to thinking that every collaborative effort in front is bad. It's the other way around. So that's my stance. So why are we talking about this now? Of course, we have a need to be collaborative back in the day for every software journey. But there are some key drivers that adds to this where we are in the landscape today. And one of those are team topologies and different mindsets going from project towards product. And within that, there are a lot of changes how you look at development and your organization as a whole. I will not delve into this further. If you haven't read this book, please do. It divides software teams into 4 different topologies, and the most important part for the topic today is, of course, they also talk about collaboration models, dependencies in how collaborative teams are with each other, because those contracts are the hard part. And as of late, you have all heard a different terminology from moving from having a proxy that is the proxy for product, customers, clients, and answering everything to you in the team, and the more strive for a product mindset where the team participates in stakeholder discussions, domain experts, and have direct contact to client and customers, actually owning the product as a team. And this has a lot of different incarnations, but it's a strive, and all is based around what team topology is called a stream-aligned team that is closest to the business, and that should be autonomous and have less cognitive load. So that's an ongoing trend with a lot of different incarnations, and that highlights collaboration. So today we're going to look at 3 different collaboration formats, and the main driver from these formats are they are rather tech friendly. They stems from event-driven architecture in the most cases, and also a background from the domain-driven community or the modeling community in this scenario. And we'll go through these 3 tools, and we should talk about relation to other tools, resources, when to use what could you do to improve, and when should you maybe not try these things. So, first out is the most broad tool. And a lot of these things I'm going to talk about might feel like it's too simplistic. How could this even be a thing? Until we dwell deeper. So domain storytelling is one of those that when you first see it, how could this even be a thing? And then later, things will emerge. So domain storytelling is about telling stories. In our community, we know that storytelling is a part of user journeys, things like that. Now we're talking about domain stories, actors in a process, and how actors relate to each other. And the quotes here is that storytelling is in the heart of the human communication, so we could build upon that. But to be able to use domain storytelling, we need to record these stories, look at a shared language, and then we need some form of representation. So we are back to this shared language, shared understanding is good for something. So let's see how that could look. So domain story could be as simple as this. We have a moviegoer that buys a ticket. This is a complete story or complete sentence, but we are going to use a pictographic language to build upon the actors, the act they are doing, the work object they are interacting with, and another party to get to the full sentence. And already here, we are seeing the importance of capturing a process, the actual actors, and most importantly, the language. And from a developer perspective, you could also already now see, oh, this work object thing, that is probably close to where software would be implemented. So how could I make assumptions how that could relate to software? This, of course, spans and spans depending on the level you are executing on. It could be sub-processes, it could be whole organizations, you could do this at different levels, but it's the same pattern. Actor that interacts on work object that reaches another actor or another system that formulates a sentence. And now you're all thinking, who the heck came up with something that simple and then named it something? The trick here is, when we go deeper, how this could be utilized to both hinting tactical implementation, but most importantly, giving you a shared understanding between stakeholders. Do we understand the problem? Or could we actually visualize the problem so we are on the same page what we're going to try to solve or achieve? But this is all done depending on levels. We'll get back to this. Everyone on board so far? Pretty straightforward. Next tool, the most common tool, or the tool that is easiest to find resources about, stems from the event-driven world and called event storming. And this is by design an even easier formula. So the creator of event storming is rather famous in the community. He has a lot of quotes and a lot of brilliant things, but think about the first one. It's not the domain expert's knowledge that goes into production, it's the developer's assumptions of that knowledge that goes into production. So each level of communication in your organization, you know the whispering game, there is a lot of assumptions. Bad requirements and bad understanding will mean that developers are making assumptions. And when assumption is corrected, you have a snowball effect that code that was incorrect with assumptions is corrected and corrected and corrected and corrected, is rather expensive and leads to bad design, of course. So we're back to shared understanding is valuable for every participant. So if you don't understand what you're doing, that will mimic your misunderstanding in what you produce, of course. And it's not only the developer that produces things based on misunderstanding. A lot of middle management doesn't know things as well, and up you go. The other quote is, if we want autonomous teams, people won't self-organize around a system they don't understand. How could we improve and create a good product if we don't know what the product should be? And how could we improve it if we don't know what the customer wants or the product organization wants? We are probably all good-hearted and want to build something, and if you don't build features, people tend to introduce complexity instead. So lose-lose. Event storming is not focused on actors' interactions in a process or a part of a process between actors. It's more interested in a process based on time. So at its core, it's as simple as stating business facts, things in a past tense, order completed, order created, ordered cancelled, and place that on a timeline. And having these simple discussions with stakeholders, with domain experts, and just see what is the correct order of things, and then start to build out knowledge from that. So if you go into a real workshop using event storming and you have several representatives of domain experts in the business, I promise you, you will get a whiteboard where things are not in agreement. Someone says, no, that is not what happened when an order is cancelled, and the order is cancelled over here. It's not over here. What do you mean by this? That's the discussion you want. That are the vague requirements and the vague implementations within the organization's processes as well. So at its core, it's basically going from the right to the left. Find the most valuable business events that the business wants to record or want to achieve and go to the left. So in an e-commerce, payment completed, cha-ching, we don't want that. How does a system reach that state? Go from right to left, back from the valuable events and go to the left. So at a higher level, you could map out a timeline of important business events, capturing both a language and a process over time, and going right to left. And then you could introduce, instead of actors, you could introduce what is creating these events. Someone is telling the system to do something, probably a state change that leads to that event, and that is called a command. And now we see a notation forming by sticky notes that we have the events that are orange and the commands that are blue. One command could lead to 0 to infinite events, and you build them up right to left over a timeline. So where we are right now, really simplistic, but also really valuable. Capturing language, capturing processes over time. But the notation grows and grows. So if you open up the toolbox, you will find things here that are related to actors, commands. You could abstract away systems in whole using a pink sticky note. You could go for tactical implementation and have a yellow sticky note for aggregate or the working object in this case. You have business facts recorded based on that interaction. That's the most important part, here called a domain event. Then, of course, the state of the system could have a multiple representation. Those are green. Representation of state in your system could have infinite representations. You have UI, you have actors that might invoke a command, and then what we're going to talk about a bit later, the most important part, a policy, more called the bullshit detector. It's the when keyword. If you are in a meeting and someone says, when an order is cancelled, remember to send that email, deduct the membership premium account, blah, 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 blah. Search for the word when. Here you have constraints and here you have processes. When something happens, where should I go next? What has happened before? So policies are the when keyword, also known as the bullshit detector, and this could look like this. Not doing the real workshop format. This is just the same notation in a physical representation where we see an actor executing something, that could lead to an event, and we could have policies issuing other commands. And if you want to be advanced, you could go to this level and expand the notation until you get the most important thing here to note for the next slide is hotspots. When you're conducting these workshops, you might be in disagreement, or you might find complexity, vagueness, so you could mark things that this is a complexity hotspot, something is not really correct here. Let's go back to that. Other than that, it's basically the same thing. You could have some notes, someone has driven by revenue, put a dollar sign. And this in reality could have many, many looks depending on how you utilize the notation. Those workshops are often quite vast if you're doing it on an outside perspective from the team, where you're doing it at an organizational level or product level. If you're doing it on a team level, you might have a different scope. But the most important part we're going to talk about is utilizing the notation is one thing. Understanding the workshop format is one thing. Delivering value and facilitating this with expectations, that's a whole different bag. So take that with you. We're going to get back to that. And this is a representation how this could look over time, where we see we change the timeline. The participants here have a lot of hotspots, disagreements, sub-processes over time. So basically what we are seeing here is a framework. You have a post-it notation and you have practices, but it's a foundation what you could use to your advantage. But agreement is of course key. The last and third part here is called event modeling. And now things are going to get not tricky, but more opinionated. The creator of event modeling is rather opinionated, but I would say that there are gold on the end of the rainbow in this one, for sure. So now we get more academic and more philosophical. So if you read this, show me your flowcharts and conceal your tables, and I shall continue to be mystified. Show me your tables, and I will usually need your flowcharts, not need your show, they'll be obvious. So what the heck is he talking about here? So the notion here is, if we're focusing on the process, so by focusing on the state and not the logic, we could infer the behavior. So if we go through time looking at the system, how it changes state or raises events, logic could be inferred. Are you with me so far? It's a mind trick. So what the heck is going on here? Now, we are seeing the same framework notation from event storming utilized in a different manner. Gone are a lot of coloring. We are having a much, much simpler model here, consisting of green, blue, orange. That's it. So we have commands, events, and views. Everything else is lost. The kicker here is that this format shines when you are at the level interacting with design, where UX drives the state of the system. Because here you're utilizing wireframes, Figma sketches, whatever, and you have your actors in swim lanes using UIs. And then you plot out a timeline. Now, this time you're focusing on system state transformation, seeing how could state in the system go forward in time, and how is that reflected by the user experience in the UI. So at the team level, this is killer if everyone is on the same page. Because now you could start mapping out task-driven UIs, see how information flows, state changes relate to UI. You could also map how UI displayed on a screen is related to the interaction that goes back. And on the back end, you have the same feature with swim lanes where you could try and find the boundaries of information, who owns the side effects or who owns the state. And this could be different boundaries, subsystems, capabilities, or whatever. So this is a quite heavy picture. It's a legend over the whole format. This could, of course, look more formal. There are Miro templates and other things that breaks this down to a more clearer and consensus view. And now we have yet another killer feature of this aspect. As you see, between the actors in role 1 and role 2, now we could also start and map endpoints to our interactions. So we could choose to place endpoint schemas or endpoint contracts as a swim lane for the actors driving the whole experience with state changes from left to right, including UI, endpoint naming conventions. Depending on tool, you could have schemas for everything, and you're basically specifying the system. And if you go further and look at what the author of event modeling is saying, he basically runs a business on top of this, where all the consultancy gigs they do, you try to utilize this. And one thing he says is, if you do this correctly, you could go fixed price, because you could slice your system and you could basically estimate costs for slices of the system, because it's a blueprint. And there are more tools, of course, where this could look quite different. And if you look closely, and you could go for this product and see what this is heading, is when you have these formulas, automation is around the corner. So if you could specify things as a blueprint, automation, AI, whatever, is around the corner to help you implement. So let's take a really, really trivial example of these three formats, just to drive the thought process home. I'm not here to teach you all these formats and say, now you're experts. I'm here to pique your interest in visual collaboration instead of code. That's the goal here. So let's go for something simple. Rock, paper, scissors. Hopefully everyone is on board how this works. Let's see rather wrongful implementation. You could maybe spot the error here. Using all these three things to declare how rock, paper, scissors works. So here, follow the flow. Player 1 makes a move. Move is central here. Makes move on the gaming server. The gaming server starts a new game, applies the move, returns game started to player 1. Player 2 continues, makes a move. The game server do the same dance and then informs the players of the end result. The missing piece here is, of course, how player 2 gets the information to make his decision. It's not visual. Doing the same thing with event storming would be like this. Player 1 issues a command, make move. The work object, the aggregate or whatever, is game. That returns 2 events, game started, move made. That is a new representation of system state that is ongoing games. Player 2 looks at ongoing games, makes its move on the game ended and the move is made and the game result view is produced. The same line of thinking, the first one via actors, the other one through time and events. And lastly, lack of UI skills, just boxes. Driving this from wireframes is rather similar between this and this, but now we have more concepts. We have UI, we have how the screens behave, we have a single swim lane nominated. That game is probably one boundary. We have interactions, we have no APIs defined, but you imagine from the screens before how simple this could be to specify. And if you have that, 4 features or a discussion within your team, I think implementation could improve for sure. So the question now is, what the heck? When should I use this and why? And now comes the biggest caveat that I need to drive home. As I said, these are tools in your tool belt. If you're in a safe environment or within your team and everyone is on board, exploration is cheap. But if you immaturely go around promising things, say, hey, I'm going to run a workshop, invite domain experts, bring the business, I will show you value, and you fail because you cannot facilitate these workshops, you're in big trouble. So experiment in safe environments, close to home. The real value is the higher up the chain you go, the value increases, but don't go there unprepared. So every format I have showed here has workshops, books, everything to educate you, to facilitate. Participate and understand is simple. Facilitate is hard. So, facilitation, incorporating your key stakeholders in the software design process. That's what we want to do if we can facilitate. And this then could be used to improve a system, of course, envision a new system, explore. As consultants, we explore a lot. Every time you enter a new domain, you need to prove your understanding and say, is this right? So explorations of new domains is really good. And then you have design of systems. You could use that at the tactical level within your team. You could design it further. You could also design at different level, design processes, or by event modeling, incorporate wireframes and task-based UI and drive design with a blueprint. So, I need to answer the question, when should you use what? My recommendation to you is the most versatile tool is domain storytelling because it's as simple. So I promise you, next time you go to a meeting that instructs a reality saying this is how something works, if you, in the minutes from that meeting, using a tool I will show you later, do an event modeling, send out that, oh, this is what my picture from the meeting, is this worldview correct? The reaction will be, whoa, what did you draw that in and how did you make those minutes? And you will be the hero of that meeting. A super simple trick because it's looked good and you're also getting valuable feedback. The next step, of course, is trying different concepts out, moving forward, probably starting in your team. And if it's interesting, go look for the workshops. Next, now to the technical parts. Depending on time, I think we might have 15. These are the fun parts, but here be dragons. So in the abstract, I promised that using these things with developers could hint implementation. So you have a trick here. As soon as you're using these tools, you are speaking a language that everyone understands, but you are actually designing software at the same time. But the other people don't need to know how you think. So how do you do that? Lending a page from functional patterns, I'm going to have some quasi functions here, just explaining how things could work in a system. So a blue sticky note everywhere is basically command, and the current state of the system produces new state. Easy. It's a function. Read the state of the system, apply the command, new state, persist. That formula applies to everything. But we could go further. Instead, we could say a command applied on current state produces side effects. Looks like this. And when you're now thinking about it, if I go back and say, you produce side effects, this green sticky is a representation of state, what do I save? Let's say you save the events, then you fold, reduce, aggregate over one orange sticky over current state gives you a new state. Repeat. Just loop this over history and you could project anything. Event sourcing, basically. And this drives the whole picture home. To get the view, you project from the history, apply the command on the current state, new events pop out. This means that you have infinite number of green stickies. Green stickies are just a representation of system state. It could be concurrent, it could be eventual consistent, depending on how you design your system. Then, the most important part, the lilac one, the policy, the bullshit detector, the when keyword. What is that? In event storming, it's simplified saying that an event could trigger a new command to drive a process forward. But that is seldomly correct, because to be able to make that decision, you often tend to need a representation of system state saying, when an order is cancelled, how did the order look? I make some decisions, issue commands. This is more visible in event modeling, since event modeling drives processes from views instead of events. That's in detail, but implementation-wise, they are the same. It's just abstracted in different ways. So the truth is more like this. An event is applied, a policy is applied, utilizing one representation of state for that policy to be able to produce a command if necessary, meaning that the lilac doesn't really exist. It's a function, but it has no real representation. So, I promised you some technical parts. Now, okay, you said in the beginning that if we strive for autonomous teams, the teams will interface with domain experts, clients, customers, their audience in different ways. This will probably mean that all these traits involved comes with a bag of tricks of their own. They have workshop formats. You as a techie is not alone with a bag of tricks. So what should you do? When should you use what? And there are no lack of tools or workshop formats. So let's just mention things that are closely related or often mentioned together. You might have heard of Wardley mappings, a more strategic tool. You could, let's say, buy or build scenarios. In the book about domain storytelling, there is a chapter how you could use domain storytelling for investigating buy or build. Wardley mappings is much more commonly used to navigate such scenario. Another tool could be, what about user story mapping? User story mapping is also talking about stories. What's the difference between a user story and the domain story? The user story is a planning artifact and the domain story is a process declaration. You could use them together, but in different phases. So if we had the time, we could delve into a lot of tooling that stems from the UX world or the product world, and then say, how could we leverage these? But lastly, how do we proceed? If this is interesting, I recommend you to find the domain storytelling tool. There is a hosted version. You could just clone a repo. It's a simple web application where you are forced to use this sentencing and those pictograms. And if you do that for your next meeting and send that out, you will be the hero of the day. So now I have shared the secret trick. You're all heroes instantly. Next would be start reading. What I have shown you is just a vague understanding what might be on the other side. There are books upon books, and there are a lot of workshops targeting if you want to be a facilitator using these formats, probably both in your teams and higher up, you will need to be educated. I have gone through a 3-day masterclass in event storming, and if you have the money and the time, it's a warm recommendation. And there are the same for every format of these. You could find that at conferences or going around. But start reading the books. And here you see we have a relationship to domain-driven design. Wardley mappings comes in, team topologies, in the same series as domain storytelling. We have another book just about collaborative software design using even more tricks. So to educate yourself how you could collaborate to be more efficient, avoid expensive misunderstandings based on assumptions, and practice these things will lead to a tighter feedback loop and better software design. So there's nothing to be afraid of with design up front in this regard. It's just a cheaper way forward. So with that, lunchy munchy soon. Thank you. Few minutes for questions, depending on the tummy's state.
Cheers. Now I was thinking, is this event storming, I forget all the names, it looks good for when you're producing these designs, or flowcharts essentially. But is there a good way of persisting this? Because I'm currently faced with a situation where configuration management is legally required so that we have to be able to reproduce every state of the software at any given point of time, including the designs, so that if there's something wrong with the software which doesn't align with the design, you can pinpoint where. It's all traceability essentially. Everybody says traceability. How would you persist this?
So this, if I understand your question correctly, is these blueprints, depending on format, how could I persist and also evolve over time? Because this is a living artifact.
Exactly.
Domain storytelling, the tool that I talked about, of course, have export schemas and standardized formats. So you could just check it into Git if you want to. Event storming, there are models for using Miro. There is a lot of SaaS services doing the same thing, where you basically export a schema or a format to be able to persist it. I would recommend you to look into a new tool called Event Catalog. That is a YAML declaration of kind of these things. Think Mermaid for event-driven systems. And then you could have that with the source code. So there are infinite numbers from PlantUML and other artifacts to get out of these. The hard part is to keep them up to date, because a tendency I see is to use this in design when design is new. But when you get feedback and change the design, maybe you don't update the blueprint, and then you diverge and your requirement goes out the window. So that's the hard part, to use these workshop formats even when you're changing the systems to keep the blueprint up to date.
Cheers. You didn't say SharePoint, so I'm happy.
Hey! Huge applause.